Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going deep, really deep, into 19th and 20th century India. It's a period where, frankly, the whole fabric of society was changing, and I mean drastically.
Yeah, totally. I mean, think about it. Just 200 years ago, things were completely different, especially for women and lower castes.
Right. Like, did you know that there was a time when widows were actually, praised for throwing themselves on their husband's funeral pyres?
It's wild, isn't
It's
it?
crazy. We're also going to be talking about this guy named Rao Phule, compared the struggle of lower castes to, get this, the plight of enslaved people in America.
Fascinating comparison really makes you think about global struggles for equality.
Absolutely. So to really kick things off, let's try to imagine what life was like for women in India about 200 years ago.
Okay.
We're talking like early 19th century.
Right.
So picture this. Girls getting married super young, like before they even hit their teens.
Yeah, child marriage was a widespread practice back then,
Yeah.
and their world was basically like limited to the home. Very few rights, very few freedoms.
Okay, so really restricted lives. But why, though? Like, what was the thinking behind all of this?
Well, it's important to remember that these practices were deeply rooted in the social and religious norms of the time, not just random, you
Yeah,
know?
I see. Like, it was just how things were.
Yeah. A good example is the practice of sati.
Sati, right.
Mm.
That's when a widow would basically throw herself on her husband's funeral pyre.
Yeah. It's hard to grasp today, but back then it was seen as a mark of devotion, like the ultimate sacrifice. Of course, often there was a lot of pressure, even coercion involved.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So societal expectations, religious beliefs, all playing a part.
Huge role, yeah.
So it's a pretty grim picture, right?
Right.
But then something happened, something that really started to shake things up. The printing press?
Oh, yeah, the printing press, big turning point.
Right. Suddenly, ideas could spread like wildfire. Books, newspapers, pamphlets. It sparked so much debate and discussion.
Exactly, like a catalyst for change, you know? People could actually get informed, form their own opinions, and challenge those old traditions. Before, it was much harder.
So basically, the printing press was like this big loudspeaker for new ideas.
Perfect analogy.
And with that, we start to see reformers emerging, like Raja Mohan Roy.
Oh, yeah, Roy, a key figure.
He was really outspoken against Sati, and he was a big advocate for women's education, right?
Totally. He was brilliant. You know, what I find interesting about him is how he actually used ancient texts to challenge the interpretations that supported those harmful practices.
So kind of like beating them at their own game.
Exactly. He was a master strategist. He understood that to change deeply rooted beliefs, you had to engage with their very foundations.
Right. So it wasn't just about rejecting tradition. It was about offering a different perspective from within the same cultural context.
Precisely. And it worked. He played a key role in getting sake banned in 1829.
Wow, that's actually a real, tangible change, not just talk. It makes you realize how powerful one person's ideas can be.
For sure. But it wasn't just Roy, though, right? There were others fighting for women, too.
Yeah, definitely. There were lots of reformers at that time. I think Ishwar Chandra Vijayasagar was another one.
Ah, Vijayasagar, another big name.
Big on widow remarriage, wasn't he?
Yeah, a passionate advocate. He, too, went back to those ancient texts, showing that remarriage wasn't actually prohibited. His efforts paid off big time. The Widow Remarriage Act in 1856.
Wow, so another win for the reformers. It really shows how the legal system can be a tool for social change, right?
Totally. It's not just about rules, it's about shaping a more just and equitable society. But, you know, with change comes resistance. And this was especially true when it came to the education of girls.
Yeah, I can imagine that was a tough one.
Yeah.
Like suddenly girls are learning, stepping outside those traditional roles.
It was a huge shift, and a lot of people were anxious about it. Concerns about girls being corrupted by education, neglecting their duties at home, or even just being out in public.
Yeah, like the whole social order is being challenged. It must have been pretty scary for some people.
Oh, for sure. And those concerns reflected the deeply patriarchal structure of society at the time. But, you know, some reformers weren't deterred. Vidyasagar, for example, and Jyotar Phule, they both set up schools for girls. They were convinced that education was the key to empowerment.
Talk about brave.
Mm. Yeah.
That's a huge step. But what kind of education were girls getting? Was it the same as boys, or was it more focused on, like, domestic skills?
That's a great question, and it was a hot topic back then. Some people thought girls should just learn how to be good wives and mothers, while others wanted them to have the same rigorous education as boys.
Okay, so A battle over both access and content.
Yeah.
But what about the girls themselves and women in general? Did they have a voice in all of this?
Absolutely, and that's what makes this period so fascinating. Women weren't just sitting back and letting things happen, they were actively shaping the conversation. And this is where we see some really inspiring women writers emerging. They were bold, challenging the whole patriarchal system head on.
We've been talking a lot about the men, but it's great to hear about the women who are leading the charge too. Any names we should know?
Oh, for sure. There's Tarabai Shinde. She wrote this incredible critique of gender inequality. It's called Strepurushpilna, which means a comparison between women and men.
Just the title is a statement. What kind of things did she talk about?
Well, she really exposed the double standards that women faced. There's this one line that's so powerful. She says, "Isn't a woman's life as dear to her as yours is to you? It's as if women are made from something different from men altogether, made from dust, earth, rock, rusted iron, while you and your lives are made from the purest gold."
Wow, that's such a powerful image. It really drives home the point about how differently men and women were valued.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing Tarabai Shinde wasn't the only one writing about these issues.
Oh, definitely not. Pandita Ramabai was another prominent voice. A real scholar, she knew Sanskrit inside out. She was a sharp critic of Hinduism, especially the way it treated women. She even set up a home for widows, giving them shelter, education, and a way to support themselves.
So not just talking the talk, but walking the walk too. Amazing. You know, we've been talking about these legal reforms like banning sati and allowing widow remarriage, and it seems like they were successful in changing the laws. But how did that actually happen? Like, how did these reformers turn their ideas into real change?
Good question. I think one factor was the growing influence of Western ideas like individual rights and equality.
Yeah.
Many reformers had been exposed to these ideas, and they saw how they could transform India.
So they were inspired by what was happening in other parts of the world.
Yeah, and the political scene was changing too. The British, even though they weren't always keen on social reform, were under pressure to deal with issues like sati. It had gotten a lot of bad press internationally.
I see. So the reformers were smart. They used that pressure to their advantage.
Exactly. They argued that India needed these reforms to progress.
So it's like a mix of local and global forces coming together. Really interesting. But let's get down to the nitty-gritty. How did these legal reforms, especially those related to sati and widow remarriage, actually impact women's lives? Like, what real changes did they bring about?
Well, the impact was huge, but change doesn't happen overnight.
Of course, yeah.
The banning of sati sent a strong signal. It showed that the state was no longer okay with this practice. That gave women and their families more power to resist the pressure, even if those pressures didn't completely disappear.
Right, so like a shift in the power dynamics, even if it was subtle.
Exactly. And legalizing widow remarriage, even though it was controversial at first, slowly opened up possibilities for widows. It challenged the idea that their lives were over after their husbands died. They now had the choice to remarry and start anew.
That's a huge shift in perspective. So legal reform can create a framework for social change, but societal attitudes take longer to catch up, right?
Yeah, it's a process for sure. But before we dive into the complexities of social change, I'm curious to hear your thoughts. What stands out to you about these early reform movements? What do you find most significant?
That's a good question. Let me think. I think what gets me is just how brave these reformers were, especially the women. Like, they were going up against centuries of tradition. It's amazing.
It really is. They were pioneers, no doubt, paving the way for future generations to fight for equality. But, we can't talk about social change in 19th and 20th century India without talking about the caste system. It's huge.
Right. The caste system is such a complex system, so deeply embedded in society.
It really was, and it created such stark inequalities. Imagine a society where your entire life, like your job, your social standing, even your access to basic resources, is determined by your birth.
It's hard to even wrap your head around that. Like, it goes against everything we believe in today about equality and opportunity.
Oh, yeah, for sure. But for centuries, that was the reality for millions of people in India. At the top, you had the Brahmins, who were traditionally priests and scholars, and then below them, you had all these other castes, each with its own specific role.
Okay, I get it. Like a rigid hierarchy, everyone in their place.
Exactly. And then at the very bottom, you had the untouchables. They faced unimaginable discrimination, like barred from temples, wells, even classrooms. It's heartbreaking.
It's a dark chapter for sure. But how did this system, which had been around for centuries, start to face challenges during this time of reform?
Well, remember how we talked about the printing press being this powerful tool for spreading ideas? That played a huge role here, too. For the first time, voices from marginalized communities could be heard, challenging the status quo.
Right. So information and the ability to share it become weapons against oppression.
Absolutely. And this is where someone like Jyotirao Phule comes in.
Phule, yeah. He was a radical thinker, wasn't he?
Oh, yeah, totally radical. He refused to accept the way things were. He had experienced the brutality of prejudice firsthand, coming from a lower caste himself. And he dedicated his life to fighting for equality.
And he drew inspiration from all sorts of movements around the world, right?
Exactly. He even compared the situation of lower castes in India to the plight of enslaved people in America.
That's right. He dedicated his book, Gulamgari, which means slavery, to the American abolitionist movement.
Bold move. He saw the parallels between these struggles. He was saying that the caste system wasn't some divine order, but a man-made system to keep people in their place.
So he was challenging the very foundation of the caste system, its legitimacy.
Exactly. And he didn't stop there. He argued that this whole idea of Aryan superiority, that upper castes were descendants of a superior race, was a fabrication to justify their dominance.
Whoa, he was really going after the core beliefs of the caste system.
He was. And he urged those at the bottom, the Shudras and Ati Shudras, to unite and fight back.
Wow, talk about a visionary. So Phule was planting the seeds of resistance, giving people hope. But he didn't just talk about it, did he? What about the Satyashodak Samaj?
Ah, yes, the Satyashodak Samaj, the truth-seeking society. That was his platform for action. They promoted caste equality, challenged the Brahmins, and pushed for education for everyone. They organized meetings, published pamphlets, even set up schools for lower castes.
So they were creating real change on the ground, providing access to education, which had been denied for so long.
It was a huge step, and his work inspired so many others. But Phule wasn't the only one fighting this fight. There were other movements popping up all over India, each with its own unique approach.
Yeah, it seems like there was this groundswell of resistance building during this period.
Absolutely. Like in central India, you had Ghasidas working to improve the lives of leather workers. He started the Satnami movement, which focused on self-reliance and spiritual equality.
Interesting. So different approaches, but all aiming for a more just society.
Exactly. And down in Kerala, you had Sri Narayana Guru, who said that we all belong to one caste, basically advocating for unity and harmony.
So it was a multi-pronged attack on the caste system, happening all across India.
It was. And this momentum carried right into the 20th century, with figures like Dr. B.R. Ambedkar.
Ambedkar, the architect of the Indian Constitution, a document based on equality and justice for all.
That's the one. And what's amazing is that he himself had faced terrible discrimination.
It's incredible how someone who went through that could become such a powerful voice for change.
It really is. His legacy is immense. He shaped the way we think about caste and social justice in India. He was a brilliant scholar, a powerful speaker, and a fearless advocate for the rights of Dalits.
Dalits, right? That's the term he used for those previously considered untouchable.
Exactly. And one of the most powerful things he did was lead those temple entry movements.
Oh yeah, those were powerful, challenging centuries of exclusion.
For centuries, Dalits had been banned from temples, seen as impure. Ambedkar challenged this head-on, leading them into temples, asserting their right to worship, their equal standing in society.
It was a symbolic act, but so powerful, forcing people to confront the reality of caste discrimination.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just about temples. Ambedkar fought for equality in education, employment, politics.
So he was attacking the caste system from all angles. But he wasn't alone, was he? There were other movements happening, especially in South India.
Right. E.V. Ramaswamy Naikar, or Periyar as he's known, led the self-respect movement. It focused on building self-esteem among lower castes and rejecting the authority of Brahmanical traditions.
There you are, yeah. He was known for being pretty radical, right?
He was a firebrand. A strong critic of Hinduism, he said that Hindu scriptures perpetuated caste divisions and the oppression of women. He wanted a complete overhaul of society.
Rejecting the scriptures altogether, that's a bold statement. How did people react to him?
It was controversial, to say the least. He had fierce opponents, but he also inspired a huge following, especially in Tamil Nadu. His ideas really shook things up.
So we're seeing all these different forms of resistance against the caste system, all happening around the same time.
Yeah. And it's important to remember that these weren't just abstract ideas. These were real people fighting for their lives, for a chance at a decent life. And they made a difference. They forced people in power to acknowledge that things needed to change.
It's inspiring to see how much they achieved. So we've covered the fight for women's rights and the struggle against caste discrimination. But before we move on to the broader impact of these movements, what stands out to you about this fight for caste equality?
You know, what really strikes me is the focus on education. It's like this thread that runs through all these movements.
Yeah, totally. Like Jyotirao Phule setting up schools for lower castes, and Pandita Ramabai making sure widows had a place to learn and support themselves.
Exactly. It shows that education was about so much more than just learning stuff. It was a way to break free from oppression, to empower people.
It's a powerful idea for sure. Knowledge is power.
Right.
But let's zoom out a bit. How did these reform movements, the ones for women's rights and those against the caste system, impact, like the bigger picture, Indian society? Did they influence any other movements that were happening at the time?
Oh, absolutely. These movements didn't happen in isolation. They were happening right alongside the growing nationalist movement.
The movement for independence from Britain.
Yeah, that one. A lot of reformers saw the British as a big obstacle to progress. They were saying that real freedom couldn't happen without tackling those deep social divisions in Indian society.
Right, so it's not just about political independence, but about creating a more just and equal society for everyone.
Exactly. It was about recognizing that true liberation meant dismantling both external and internal systems of oppression.
Okay, I get it. So they were interconnected. But I bet there were also some tensions and disagreements along the way, right?
Right.
After all, these movements had different goals and ways of doing things.
Oh, yeah, for sure. There were definitely some heated debates, especially between those who were focused on social reform and those who were all about political independence.
Like, which comes first, political freedom or social justice? A bit of a chicken and egg situation.
Totally. Some nationalists thought that the fight against British rule should be the top priority. They said everything else could wait. But the reformers pushed back. They said that true freedom couldn't wait.
Yeah, it's hard to argue with that. Were there any specific issues where these tensions really came to a head?
Well, one example is the whole debate around women's suffrage.
The right to vote.
Yeah. Some nationalist leaders thought women should just focus on supporting the independence movement and put their demands for voting rights on hold. But a lot of women activists weren't having it.
Yeah, I can imagine. They had been fighting so hard for their rights.
Exactly. They said that their political participation was essential for shaping the future of the nation. They argued that true independence meant equality for everyone, men and women alike.
It's hard to argue with that logic. So how did this whole debate play out?
It was a long and complicated process with a lot of back and forth. But in the end, when India gained independence and adopted its constitution, it included universal adult franchise. So everyone got the right to vote, regardless of gender or caste.
That's a huge win. It shows that the reformers were really effective in pushing for lasting change. It's so interesting to see how these movements for women's rights, caste equality, and independence were all intertwined.
Yeah. They were all part of this larger wave of change sweeping through India.
So as we wrap up our deep dive here, I'm wondering, how do these historical struggles resonate with India today? Like, what challenges are still out there?
That's the million-dollar question. India has come a long way since independence. But the legacy of these struggles is still very much present. Gender inequality, caste discrimination, access to education and healthcare, these are all ongoing battles. The fight for a truly just and equitable society is far from over.
It's a reminder that progress isn't always a straight line, right? There are going to be bumps along the way.
Absolutely. But the lessons from this period are still so relevant. The courage of those who fought for change, the power of collective action, the belief in a better future, these are things we can all learn from.
Well said. And to our listeners, we leave you with this. How do these historical struggles inspire you to get involved in the challenges of today? What can you do, big or small, to contribute to a more just and equitable world? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.